And that reminds me, I want to tell you, Aaron, that one thing I'm doing in my calendar is specifically blocking off Thursday afternoon and all Friday for just like no work, because we got to talk to girls. Always listening, constantly trying to figure out what are we missing, what do they know that we don't know yet. I think that's the biggest thing, is always assume that your students know more than you in terms of what the problem is. At the same time, this weird paradox of knowing that sometimes they don't know what the most healthy thing is for them. Learning how to balance that is, I think, what makes a really, it's what distinguishes a really high-level company from a company that still works too much within their own dogmatisms, thinks that they know how exactly it needs to look. I've seen our progression, even in the last year, has been crazy. Just with thinking we knew everything already and thinking our structure was set, opening our ears up more to the players and having relationships with players go south because we thought we knew better than them. In some cases we did, but you can't approach it like that. You can't approach it from a level where we know best always. It has to be, we think we know a decent amount, but show us where we're missing something. So I'm gonna go work out for the next couple hours, because I haven't in too long, and then we're gonna meet back up and take some calls and do some work up at this rooftop bar where they got a nice sunset. One thing I've been thinking about, just from my experience over the last 2 weeks and phasing in and out a lot between having a place that you're settled and then being on the move, what changes is that your scheduling process almost inevitably, when you're on vacation or when you're traveling for work, it becomes more dynamic. And by that I mean you're literally like scheduling on the go. Like a lot of times too, when I'm doing free content with players, I'll post something and I'll be like, well, can you guys meet tonight? And so now I'm like, okay, so there's a call tonight that's gonna happen. I'm looking forward to getting back to a very structured schedule where you can just sort of put your head down and pump results, because it's hard doing it this way. Like there's a lot of fun aspects of it, but it's really difficult. So we're headed over to the place next door. It's a cool rooftop bar. I'm gonna spend some time marking some hands. I'm gonna use a player who I still work with on a one-on-one basis. He's one of the only guys I still do this with. But I wanna show you guys basically what it looks like when we do player consults, hand history consults for our higher division players. If the noise level is right, I'm gonna do a call with Patrick, who's my little brother. He's the lead of our diagnostics division for Detox. He does all the data crunching and all that stuff. If it's too noisy, we'll come back, we'll do it in the house. So here's one more little secret so that you can get the max out of reviewing someone else's hands. I talked about labeling hands 1, 2, and 3. I like to do a 4, and that one's just for me. Hands that I'm not sure of, that I think are gonna be upgrades for me, those go in 4. So at the end of the day, after I go in and I solve the number 3 hands, which are the inconclusive hands, I end up with a hyper library of hands from this guy's review that are perfect for me to study from in the future. I want to give you guys stuff like this because a lot of what I talk about is more mindset oriented and it's less tangible. But if I can give you an upgrade like this that you can go put into practice like tomorrow with your studies, that's really good in my opinion. because that equals win rate for you. Type of thing where you walk away from running a lot of hands in someone's batch, and at this stage I feel like I can sort of sense what people think after looking at a lot of their hands. Coached enough players to be able to read into what type of paradigm they operate from. And one thing that I noticed from this player's hands is that almost every opportunity where he had the chance to do something quite creative, especially on the aggro side, he was finding a chance to invest as opposed to check or fold. Now granted, I'm looking at larger pots, so I'm getting a biased skew, but I'm also seeing a lot of spots where this is happening, and I know how many of those types of spots there's usually supposed to be in like a 10,000 hand submission batch. This player has an extraordinary amount of creative free rolls, I would call them, and that's at best that's what you can call it. So what's the problem with this? Is there really a problem? Is it just a stylistic thing? In a vacuum, did he say go this way? All right, so in a vacuum, nothing really wrong with this. Because if I can't prove that what you're doing is negative EV, if we can't say that this really creative play is suboptimal, then I can't really call you out on it. What does happen though is that generally this type of thinking, a player that has a low level of accountability for zones that he chooses to invest in, that will manifest in some sort of blatant misperception of a hand down the road. So the way I see this in the macro now is that the guy who's got a lot of like inconclusive aggro zones in his hands popping up, or I'm not really sure if that's a mistake, but it just almost starts to look sloppy. It looks like a sloppy investment strategy. What I've noticed is that it doesn't matter if those certain hands can't be proven to be mistakes. What I've noticed is that that player always has a higher amount of clear mistakes in his batch too. So there's a very high correlation between guys who take a lot of aggro spots and show up having a lot of clear leaks, clear large pot leaks, like mind explosion leaks. So what does this tell us? It tells us that something about having a low level of accountability or a low requirement for letting yourself press call or allowing yourself to make that bluff. Something about taking that type of investment style causes you to blow up more frequently. And I don't think this should be that hard to understand as long as you don't overthink it. Because all we're really saying is that someone who's always trying to find a reason to invest will eventually start to rationalize for investing in zones that don't make sense. And that's the real problem. Most guys never look that far. They just say, well, you can't prove that hand is a mistake, so at worst it's just a high variance play. That would be true if we looked at it from one level or one dimension. But when you look at it in the spectrum of somebody's 100,000 hand sample, that hand that you just click call on or just decide to make that bluff this time, that's connected to a pattern of sloppy investment strategy that ultimately shows up as a clear leak. That's the problem. So we were just talking about how much we like this city, and I was trying to figure out how to convey this to someone who doesn't travel a lot. You constantly hear people say something like, well, that's a very livable city. But if you don't have the context for that, if you haven't been to places that are unlivable, you don't really understand what they mean by that. So like, I would call this an extremely livable city. It's something about the vibe. Vienna, I felt the same way as soon as I touched down there. I went there recently. I said, this is one of the most livable cities I've ever been in. And we were talking about what makes it that way. I think it's a combination of some intangible, like there's just a chill energy. Also just like the nature is really cool. But when we were walking around last night, we also realized, we said at the same time, we're like, yo, it's clean. And it's something that I think is very, very underrated when you're looking at the differences between cities that you didn't like and cities that you like. The pollution and cleanliness, I think, are things that sort of fly under the radar, and you're not really all that aware of it. You can't really put your finger on it. But when you arrive in a city that's just very clean in all aspects, you notice it as this adjective of, oh, that city is livable. Okay, so I'm about to call my bro Patrick up, and I'm gonna look through these number 3 hands with him, the ones that I'm not sure about, the ones that I need to go deeper into the data on. He's my diagnostics guy, and so I always wanna get not just a second opinion, but like, he literally has more knowledge than I do in this territory at this stage in the game, because a lot of the biggest pushes we've made as a company have been pushes we made in the second half of 2018 with putting products like Ether out, and we have a lot of back-end stuff in the private archives of Ether, and he has access to all that. So if I'm doing something like this and I want to make sure that we get the most win rate out of our time, Pat needs to be on the call.
So I just got a clean build of the new Ether single raise pots. It's just been like a constant war for the past couple of weeks.
What do you mean a clean bill?
A clean build, like without any corruptions. Because the database that I am trying to build right now is like way bigger than Ether was. About 5 times bigger, I would say. And hand to node just has some natural limitations, and it can't go that big. Ether studied about 6,000 situations. It had 6,000 unique filters. And what I'm finding is that once you go over 12 or 13,000, it starts to get really buggy, and then if you go into like 25 to 30,000 territory, it just completely falls apart. So it's been like, you know, like when those guys climb Everest and they have to like cut the tags off of their clothing to drop weight. They go to that level of detail, like they just, every little thing. That's what it's like. But I at least have Ether single raise pots for formations building right now, and I have night vision without formations in the same database. I'm hoping I can get at least night vision and Ether single raise pot all in one database. And then I'll have to do 3 bed pots in another database, which will be a pain in the ass because I won't be able to like if we're doing stuff like this and you show me a single raise pot, I'll be able to answer that. But then if you have a 3-bet question and I have to go into my database for it, I can't. I have to rebuild stats and wait a whole day while it rebuilds.
What's the ETA?
I don't know. I mean, I can't say because every time I think that I'm about to be done, something breaks and I have to rebuild a bunch of shit. So the ETA is when it's done, basically. I've decided that we can't forbid people from speculating on a case-by-case basis because, like, clearly there is a lot of variation from player to player about what they will bluff at. And when you look at pool data, you're just looking at the average. And I just think that there's a big difference between speculating about pool trends, which is never good, and speculating about an individual player, which obviously there's some probability that you will be right.
Some increased probability because you've been playing with that guy.
Yeah, I just think that there's a blurry line between speculation and insight. Like if we are to take the data too literally, we run the risk of just playing like robots and being blind to what's actually happening.
I mean, yeah, that's true, but that implies that the human has a better insight on a specific profile in real time than the data is able to.
Yeah, I think that a good poker player is able to do that. I mean, that's the gift of being a human is um, you're better at seeing the signal in the noise than a computer is.
But what do you think that looks like in real time? Is it like a meta radar that he just senses that this guy's going to go off in this hand at this time? Because it almost by definition can't be something quantifiable.
It can be a recognition that a player seems to be deviating from pool tendencies. Um,
But would
like if you see multiple showdowns, you can kind of take a Bayesian approach and say, it looks like this guy actually is creatively bluffing in lines that the pool doesn't, on average, think to bluff in. It can also just be you're seeing a subtlety which might fit into a larger pattern in Ether, but the subtlety is powerful enough that it actually makes it different. Like, for example, a very basic example would be not all four card straights are created equal.
right, right. I think that's a good
So,
one to use.
so there's definitely, I think, room for case by case speculation. And I don't want us to like um, reject a player
For sure.
like Logan when he says that he has a read on somebody. It just needs to be kept. It, basically, I think it needs to be always stated in probabilistic terms.
Right.
And the only time we should reject it outright is when a student
Offers no
states,
quant at all.
yeah, or states it with complete certainty, you know.
Right, right.
Like this fish was never bluffing. No, you saw three showdowns. In each case, he had a 35% likelihood of bluffing, and you got the 65% three times in a row, you know?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there's a big difference in the two cases where the one case is acceptable and the other case isn't. But this is like the most slippery slope of anything you can give extra leash on. That's the only thing that worries me about it.
It is for sure, but I know you've had this argument with Logan like probably a million times.
Well, I've been giving him a ton of leash because I don't want to make the same mistake that we made earlier in the year where we actually lost potentially very winning players by not giving them autonomy.
The player will always say, yeah, I can't prove that I'm right, but you can't prove that I'm wrong either.
It's so funny. I was just saying this walking over. I can prove a high correlation between someone who chooses to invest very often when they have the gray zone option and someone who also has a lot of really big mistakes show up frequently in a batch.
Mhm.
I can't prove that the exact investment spot is negative EV, but I can prove it draws correlation to them blowing up more often.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so far we've seen a few big mistakes that are just clear pool trends and one heads up hand, which looks bad based on Ether, but we have to keep in mind that Ether is based on 6 max, and heads up players can get a lot crazier.
So go back on how you see this looking if we introduce this increased autonomy for people to use insight, for our players to be using insight to override ether data.
I don't really know. I think it just has to be like, look, I can't prove you wrong on a micro level, but if I can prove your plays wrong on a macro level, by showing that you're going against pool trends over and over again, that's a situation where I think you have more of an argument. But if you're just talking about pure gray zones where we don't have data, I don't know how you can really say folding is better than calling.
So they need to provide some qualitative analysis with insight.
Yeah, and they have to prove that it is a legitimate gray zone. And if it's not a gray zone, if we do have data and that data does show that it's under bluff, then they need to just recognize that they chose to deviate from the data because of the strength of their perceived read on the player. And there's no way to really even prove that that's wrong, but you can kind of see a trend, obviously, if it keeps coming up in storms and they're just wrong over and over again.
Yeah. So just chopping up some stuff from that, I feel like I got a lot out of that call. For the most part, just always pushing ahead into what's more efficient, what's the next thing that we can dive into that seems like a relevant filter to run. A lot of times when you look at higher stakes hands, you come up with ideas that you wouldn't have come up with had you been just looking at raw data, raw filters. A lot of times the best way to come up with what is a relevant filter to look deeper into is to kind of feel into what does it seem like the pool might be doing. How are players at this limit getting more crafty, more aggro? And working with someone like Pat on this is like, for me, it's always a breath of fresh air to work with someone who's scientific, objective, and doesn't get emotional about the information at hand. And from my point of view, again, it's just like with these consults, it's all about listening for me. It's the biggest transition I've made this year. I get twice as smart, 10 times as smart maybe, just by switching the way that I frame these consults. Unless I'm deliberately telling a player that these adjustments need to be made for the contract to continue, if it's not that type of phone call, that's the only phone call I can think of where I'm on the deliberate end. That and maybe executive meetings. Everything else, if I'm doing a one-on-one with you, I'm always in the inquisitive posture, always listening to what you might be able to bring to the methodology, what I might be doing that's bias. A lot of times I just ask Pat straight up, poke a hole in this assumption. But it would be my biggest piece of advice to guys who are in a leadership position, flip that frame. Like, to the point of almost playing dumb. To the point where if you were to listen to that call, you would almost feel like he might be the coach. And sure, I might know the answer to some of the stuff that I'm asking, but that's not the point, because I don't know the true answer until I get many different opinions, until I get many angles of perception. And this is a really subtle point, because I can know what answer is most objective from an absolute place. That only requires me and my investigation skills to deduce that. But when you're in a leadership position and when you're running a company that has to be the best fit for a large number of people, you don't have the right answer until you look every single person of that company in the eye and communicate directly and see if it computes with them. So the correct answer for how I run my company is the sum. It's the right balance of the sum of every single piece of input of every member of that company. Then I have the right answer. So always listening to a dangerous extent.